Tonight, some major developments in the impeachment inquiry when a key witness changes earlier testimony and now says there was a quid pro quo with Ukraine. Then we wonder if this could have major ripple effects. Later, Elizabeth Warren releasing details of her health care plan, but there are still more questions than answers, especially about how she's going to pay for all of it. Also, it is election day, and there are a lot of key races that we're watching. We're going to show you why this could be an indicator of where voters stand 1 year out from the presidential election. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and if you're watching some local markets throughout the evening, we'll be updating some of those local election results. But we begin with another day of stonewalling when it comes to the impeachment inquiry. Two more Trump administration officials, they skipped their depositions today following orders from the White House. They are Michael Duffy from the Budget Office and Wells Griffith from the National Security Council. Duffy was reportedly involved in holding back aid to Ukraine, and Griffith, he was a key witness in a House meeting about Ukraine that happened just 2 weeks before Trump asked the Ukrainian president for that now infamous favor. And they join a long list of other officials who are expected to blow off proceedings this week despite requests and subpoenas. Energy Secretary Rick Perry, one of the biggest names in the list, along with former National Security Advisor John Bolton. And you can probably add Mick Mulvaney to the list. The acting White House Chief of Staff, he's been asked to appear this Thursday, but it would be a shock if he actually showed up. But one of Mike Pence's senior advisors, though, he is expected to appear. Multiple reports are saying that Jennifer Williams will in fact testify Thursday before the committee's leading impeachment inquiry. Williams would be the first person on Pence's staff to appear, and she was also in the now infamous call between Trump and the president of Ukraine. Plus, the House Intelligence Committee, they've just released transcripts of 2 more depositions that were held behind closed doors, and they're from central figures in this whole mess. Now, I'm talking about Gordon Sondland and Kurt Volker. Sondland, he is the big Trump donor who, you know, kited a check for $1 million and he was rewarded with a job as U.S. ambassador to the European Union. He's probably not thinking of that as much as a prize right now. Volker, he's former special envoy to Ukraine who was involved in trying to set up a White House meeting for the Ukrainian president that was allegedly only going to happen if Ukraine agreed to investigate the Bidens. Let's start off first with Sondland, because what we're hearing today about his testimony could prove to be the most damaging that we know to the president. He is now, and that's the key word now, the latest diplomat to testify that aid to Ukraine was contingent upon that country investigating the Bidens. Sondland, he revised his testimony this week, saying his memory had been refreshed after hearing from colleagues who admitted that there was in fact directly a quid pro quo. Now I'm going to quote a few lines here from his actual testimony. In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I presumed that the aid suspension had become linked to the proposed anti-corruption statement. He also testified that he said the following to a top aide to the Ukrainian president, quote, "The resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine provided the public anti-corruption statement that we had been discussing for many weeks." Sondland also testified he discussed Rudy Giuliani in general terms with his boss. That boss, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. He said when he discussed Rudy's role, that all Pompeo did was roll his eyes and said, yes, it's something we have to deal with. Pompeo is also facing scrutiny over the firing of Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. In testimony released yesterday, former top Pompeo aide Michael McKinley said he warned Pompeo 3 times about political motivations for getting rid of Yovanovitch. She was shown the door because she was concerned about the shenanigans going on. Now bear in mind, McKinley, he was under oath when he said this, but listen to what Pompeo had to say in a recent interview when asked directly about McKinley and the ambassador.
From the time that Ambassador Yovanovitch departed Ukraine until the time that he came to tell me that he was departing, I never heard him say a single thing about his concerns with respect to the decision.
So you were never asked to put out
not once, George, did Ambassador McKinley say something to me during that entire time period.
So again, one of them's telling the truth. One, the Secretary of State there on a Sunday talk show versus the other who testified under oath. But their versions of events could not be more diametrically opposed. Okay, Then we get to the testimony of Kurt Volker. Volker testified that he resigned because he knew a political firestorm was coming over the Ukraine. Volker also saying that he had a ton of concerns about Rudy Giuliani, and he warned many people about Rudy's role in Ukraine. Lastly, Volker said Rudy was the messenger who pushed Ukraine to explicitly say they're investigating the Bidens and interference in the 2016 election. Okay, a whole lot there to unpack, and for that we turn to our friend, former federal prosecutor Gene Rossi, who joins us now. All right, Gene, let's go first to the two folks I mentioned most of all. Sondland, either collective amnesia decided to fade here or he flipped like a gymnast today, but he did a 180 where he said, no, there was gambling in River City, there was a quid pro quo, and maybe for the balance of this interview, we'll stop talking about this in Latin terms here, and instead, this is a bribery. That's what he was talking about. If I don't get this, you're not going to get that.
Absolutely. And I got to quote the immortal words of, I think, Sir Walter Scott. Oh, what a tangled web we weave once we practice to deceive. The versions that are presented by the Trumpsters and the administration officials change like a weather vane in a hurricane. It's absolutely appalling. But what they have to realize is this. There may come a time when an aggressive prosecutor, maybe not Bill Barr, but an aggressive prosecutor who's doing the right thing is going to look at these interviews with agents, interviews with staff, and the testimony under oath and realize, just like Gordon Liddy realized, you can only lie so many times and in so many ways. I got to say this, Richard. It is absolutely appalling, the versions of events that are coming from the White House and the administration, and Secretary Pompeo's comment on national TV saying that McKinley never told him that something was rotten in Denmark. That really is offensive. But I got to defend Secretary Pompeo. When he made that statement that was ridiculous, Richard, he was not under oath, so he's not subject to perjury.
It does seem, and guys, if you can recue that side, I'm sorry, that Pompeo had from the earlier interview with Stephanopoulos, where there was what almost looked like a TV malfunction when he was pressed again on what he knew. There's this moment, in fact, let's play it now. Stephanopoulos on this week, not this past weekend, but last Sunday, pressed him about the quid pro quo and what he knew. And I think it's very telling what he didn't say in that moment.
I'm not going to get into hypotheticals and secondary things based on what someone else has said. George, you would have never done it when you were the spokesman. I'm not going to do it here today.
Except it's not a hypothetical. We saw the chief of staff, the acting chief of staff. It is, George. You just said, George, you just said, if this happened. That is, by definition, a hypothetical. The chief of staff said it did.
George, you asked me if this happened. It's a hypothetical. I've told you what I observed.
So here's where I go. I know in a talk show, guys can say whatever they want, and it's just talk. It's different than when you're under oath and saying it. But what's the downside if somebody does in fact lie? If these subpoenas that folks are avoiding like the plague, if eventually they're compelled by the court to come in and say yes, if, as we just heard today, you have the chief of staff, Mulvaney, coming in. If some of the other folks that were attached, whether it be at OMB or in other departments, come in and say, yeah, I didn't hear anything, I didn't know anything, but later on they can be placed directly in the room or on the email threads or whatever they'll say. Is there a real risk if somebody lies at this point?
Absolutely. If you can establish, Richard, as a prosecutor, if you can establish that Donald Trump encouraged and cajoled and ordered people to give knowingly false statements in the public domain and under oath, remember Michael Cohen, that is subornation of perjury, that is obstruction of justice, and I got to tell you, if you are a Democrat or if you're in the House side, there are separate articles of impeachment that are popping up with each release of these transcripts. And one of the articles of impeachment that is starting to come to fruition is this whole collage of efforts by Giuliani, by Pompeo, and the president to stop people from cooperating and telling the truth. That in itself is an obstruction, is an article of impeachment.
The thing that we heard from Volker, at least in his transcript that came out today, was a confirmation that a lot of people wondered, which is Rudy, he's not in any elected position. He hasn't even been in a confirmed position. He's a glorified personal attorney for the president. Yet he was completely going around the State Department, and he was basically conducting a one-man diplomatic effort, clearly not on behalf of U.S. interests, but behalf of his client or even himself. To that end, the fact that everybody knew he was doing these things, supposedly, as we heard at least from the testimony from Sondland, where Pompeo rolled his eyes that Rudy's going rogue, is there any exposure, not just on Rudy for what he did and on his client, but for the other people that either aided and abetted it or just stayed quiet and let him go rogue?
Well, the only exposure I can see for Rudy Giuliani and others is their knowing involvement with Lev and Igor. And they are now, both Lev and Igor, Lev Furman and Prunis, I always get their names wrong, but they have been indicted in the Southern District of New York. And what was going on there is Russian and Ukrainian money was being washed, money laundering, so that it would be put into the Republican coffers to aid the President of the United States and to get rid of Marie Yovanovitch. So if you can establish that Rudy was part of that scheme, then anybody who's helping Rudy is also part of that scheme, and they have criminal exposure.
And let's be clear, Lev Parnas, one of the two people that Mr. Rossi just referenced there, he is cooperating, as we've learned right now, in the impeachment probe. Okay, I want to read a part of what Adam Schiff, who is obviously and most of our audience knows, will be one of the major players in this, leading in effect the question on the part of the Democrats. This is what Schiff had to say. What we have found, and what the American people will soon learn, is that this is about much more than just one call. From closed-door interviews of current and former administration officials, text messages we've obtained, and public admissions by acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and the president himself, we now know that the call was just one piece of a larger operation to redirect our foreign policy to benefit Donald Trump's personal and political interests, not the national interest. So, what I'm asking is, again, there's two audiences for this. There's one audience where if, in fact, this goes along the party lines and then the House, in fact, votes to impeach, the Senate gets it. They're going to need 20 Republican senators and have every Democrat sign on to get the necessary 2/3. That's the math. But the driver of that's going to be the American public. And the American public's got to put pressure on the lawmakers to say enough is enough here. And whatever it is right now in the low 50s that want them removed, it's got to go up at least 15 points here for the lawmakers to finally say he's a bridge too far. To get there, think of the optics of the case. They've pretty much established the call happened. It's not a perfecto call, as the president said. He was trying to shake down the Ukrainian premier. Don't they have to layer even more on? Because you and I aren't the audience here, Gene. What do they have to convince the American public that we don't already know, that this was way beyond that line here of tiptoeing over a high crime and misdemeanor? This is a removable offense.
The theory of the case is this. This was a grand mosaic of arms for dirt that was not concocted on July 25th. It had been germinating for months, and it came to a crescendo on July 25th. And that call on July 25th wasn't a capricious moment. It wasn't just a moment where an idea came into Trump's head. It was an arms for dirt scheme that in the president's mind, he thought that that was the only way he could beat Joe Biden, is arms for dirt. And it gets better. After that call, there were days and weeks, if not months, of what I call the epilogue after the call to help perpetuate that scheme. And when the American people get the full Monty, if you will, of this mosaic, this scheme, pernicious. They are going to change their minds. I bet money on that. Like Joe Namath in, I guess, January of 1969, guaranteed a Super Bowl victory. When the people understand that mosaic, that arms for dirt mosaic, things are going to change dramatically. And it happened with Richard Nixon, whose approval rating did not plummet until the last couple of months.
And as a Jet fan, that's the only thing I got holding on to that moment. But to that end, Gene, you had Dean testify, and we had the tapes. Do you need a Bolton or somebody like that to finally say, yes, we'll call it quid pro quo, whatever you want. He knew, and by the way, the vice president knew. Do we need that seminal moment right now that we haven't had yet?
I think what you have is a series of mini seminal moments. You have Marie Yovanovitch, you have Taylor, you have sort of Sondland a little bit. You got all these people. You got the Lieutenant Colonel Vinland. You have all these smaller characters. You don't have a John Dean yet, but you're absolutely right, Richard. John Bolton could be the nail in the final nail in that coffin. And I got to tell you this, John Bolton is probably sitting back going, he fired me, said that he fired me unjustly, and I know all the reasons why he fired me. And John Bolton actually could be in a tremendous witness. There'll never be another John Dean, but John Bolton could come close.
And as they say, stay tuned. Gene Rossi, great job as always, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. When we come back, we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about health care. Elizabeth Warren kept telling everybody, you know, Medicare for all and it won't raise your taxes at all. Well, she's released details about her Medicare for all plan, especially how she's going to pay for it. But there are some major questions because the math just doesn't add up. Also, do voters even want what she's offering? An expert with the Washington Post. She'll join me after the break with answers on that and more.